right, guys, welcome to week 6. Only 2 more weeks to go. We're going to look at combat sports from 1995 to 2010. And keep in mind, guys, as we go through this is the next 2 weeks are going to be harder actually to discuss because you start to get a less prominent people in boxing, and you start to get more UFC happening. And unlike boxing, UFC fights happen so much more often and change championships so much more often. It's hard to keep up with. So when we left off on the last week, SEG had purchased UFC and had gotten a lot of pressure from politicians, particularly John McCain, and had virtually gone underground. And they had kind of accepted that and almost embraced it. And you started to see the fighting styles kind of evolve. People kind of, I don't want to say fell out of favor, but just didn't want to see always see Brazilian jiu-jitsu type guys fighting. And so you saw the sport make a shift toward kind of brawlers, pit fighters. Tank Abbott, which I spelled his name wrong, was a pioneer in the mid '90s, and the UFC wanted to make their events as diversified as possible. And so you saw the shift toward having more American fighters to appeal to that audience. And so as that happened, and you saw that happen over the course of several, UFCs 2, 3, 4, 5, up through there, and then you had kind of a shift in styles again. UFC 12, you had the emergence of Vitor Belfort, who a lot of people considered the great Brazilian hope. He was a Gracie disciple. He destroys Tank Abbott in UFC 13. And then UFC 15, he loses to Randy Couture, who was a wrestler. And this really ushered in the true era of MMA. And what I mean by MMA is that you could have successful fighters that were some jiu-jitsu, some boxers, some wrestlers, some brawlers, type pit fighters. And that really really appealed to a broader audience. And so really what put UFC on the map was the Zuffa acquisition. And Zuffa was the name of the company, but I'll explain a little bit more. So the late 1990s, SEG was kind of starting to shop around for a buyer of the UFC. It was on life support. And Dana White kind of caught wind of this. And you got to understand, Dana White was training fighters. He was training boxers. And he had mentioned this opportunity to two of his high school friends that they were all three from Las Vegas, Frank, Lorenzo, Ferretti. And he said, hey, I think we should purchase this. I think they were casino guys and they had money to do it. And their attorneys begged him not to purchase UFC. They didn't see a purpose in it or a way forward in it. And so in 2001, they purchased the UFC for $2 million, and they installed Dana White as the president. And this was kind of the business plan for the UFC. This was their plan to move it into prominence. They were going to try to land a pay-per-view broadcast deal. The brothers were going to work with different governments, particularly Las Vegas, to get their fights sanctioned at casinos. They were going to improve the live fight experience, meaning make it where they had a crowd that would want to come watch it in addition to paying to watch it. They wanted to increase their advertising, and they wanted to make Dana White the face of the UFC, the guy that was out in front promoting the sport. And they started to do that. And even as they started that process, they still somewhat struggle to gain traction, only because you have to appeal to a broader audience, and it's hard to do that asking people to pay to watch events. So what they did, and this, in my opinion, was the turning point of the UFC, was in 2005 they launched the Ultimate Fighter reality show. And so, for those of you who haven't seen this, it was basically a kind of a tournament style show where basically somebody could earn their right to get into the UFC. And it took a little while to get off the ground, a couple of years, but once it did, it became hugely popular. And the advantage to this was that it was on regular network TV. And so people could see it without paying for it. And this really, in my opinion, set UFC on its way to being what it is today. And we'll discuss that more next week. Some great fighters just of this era. We're talking about Randy Couture, Chuck Liddell, Royce Gracie, Bas Rutten, Matt Hughes, Tito Ortiz, Ken Shamrock. We already talked about Vitor Belfort, Frank Shamrock, Dan Henderson, Tank. I cannot spell Abbott. Tank Abbott, and Kevin Jackson. So as UFC kind of came into the limelight, boxing started to fade a little bit. And in 1995 to 2010, you still saw numerous champs and some really great fights. But by the 2000s, UFC really started taking over. There's still great heavyweight and champs during this era and lots of good foreign fighters. One of the prominent fighters we'll talk about in this is Lennox Lewis. He was born in London, England. He ended up with a 44-1-2 record. He was a 1988 gold medalist, and he held the heavyweight title multiple times. And if you go back and you look between last week's lecture and this week's lecture, what you're going to understand is there were a host of fighters that held the title multiple times. Tyson held it multiple times. Holyfield held it multiple times. Lennox Lewis held it multiple times. And so that was kind of a unique thing of this era. Kind of just some other champs during this time: Mike Tyson, Michael Moore, Evander Holyfield, Roy Jones Jr., and there are a lot of other ones. I'm, trying to give you more of a profile of the most well-known ones. Really great fight of this century of this era was Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield in 1999, Madison Square Garden. Fight ended in a draw. I put that video up today for you guys to watch under the resources. But that'll kind of conclude this week. And understand, guys, it's real difficult to going forward, particularly this week and next week, to be able to kind of talk about all the different things going on in UFC. There's just a lot. It's a lot more than boxing. But we'll close it out next week. I look forward to see what you guys do for your assignment.